Hello and welcome to Varn blog. And today we're coming back to the base building tendency, which before the ascendance of the Biden administration seemed to be a counter tendency to the DSA. One that was just as interested as the DSA in reaching out to normal people, um, but was actually trying to do slow grasp what's building up as opposed to just merely trying to instigate an electoral campaign leading to mass buildup back to electoral campaign like the center of the DSA was trying to do in lieu of the Bernie campaign. The main focus of this was the Marxist center, although there are base building tendencies within the DSA itself. At one time, the communist tendency was a base building tendency. I don't know that they would consider themselves that today. And they think my hostility to the DSA is somewhat ironic. And I'm not particularly actually hostile to the DSA. I just think that it has a conflicting mission and a conflicting culture that still is too dominated by activists and students. Not that students don't have a super important role to play because you need young people, but you know, these things are what they are. But I got an email from a former base builder who was attached to the Marxist Center. I believe she left in 2021, but she became involved after I got uninvolved with this. I was involved with the Red Party in 2016, and then left after that party's first conference, which happened before the Marxist Center's conference, which initiated it. And I don't think this is published elsewhere. This was sent to me with permission to talk about it on the show. So I'm going to share it with you and give you my commentary. And I might even share it on my Substack and my Patreon. My Substack is free. My Patreon isn't, with the permission of the author. But I've only now got the permission to share it here. But I'm going to read it and respond to it with you. I almost called this a radical engagements, but this is not available to the public. So this is not something you can go out and read. So let's pull this up, and I have removed any identifying names. I don't know this person extremely well, but some details that they have included in this actually correspond to people who I do know and am interested in talking about. And if anybody who was involved in any of these base building tendencies, the Philly Socialist, I knew Tim Horace online, for example, or any of those people. If you want to reach out and you want to do a show or send me something like this, I'll take it and I'll talk about it because I am fascinated by how this went wrong. And I'm fascinated by it because I kind of was sympathetic to it at the time. Context and disclaimer. Loosely. A RML leaning left comms, but also very into Lacan. Book. Don't laugh. I don't know. I don't left book. To study up analysis, critiques, and strategies around the socialist movement, specifically dealing with the emptying of Marxism into subcultural signification, which Griscom have talked about. You know, I don't think everyone has talked about the costly signaling of subcultural signification, but often their answers are confusing popularity or signaling popularity even with actually having electoral and political success. The base building strategy was interesting because they did see the problem in that in a way that a lot of the DSA dirty break people did not. Which was obviously the ongoing ongoing event out of which we all came together. Two of us happened to be members of the Marxist Center orgs in real life, so our small group started examining the MC as a symptom of the conjuncture as a whole, identifying where it advanced and regressed from the broader left. We were working on building a political line and tactfully building influence inside our two respective orbs to combat those points of regression and to try to prevent the tendency's liquidation into the existing left current that was meanwhile getting ready for another round of popular frontism in the form of the People's Congress of Resistance. Yay. I attempt below to summarize the contents and character of this analysis and how it played out inside the Marxist Center milieu, though I don't have a complete documentation of all this, so it's really only a gestural account of my subjective experience of the whole process as it exists in my memory. We all are stuck with that, man. I understand. I do my best to not blur it all together, but there are likely a degree of generalization and extrapolation from my direct experience to the center and the tendency as a whole, mediated by the critiques we were developing and what I was learning indirectly from my counterpart in the other org. I don't know which orgs these are, by the way. I had good relationships with some orgs in the Marxist Center and decent relationships with some orgs that moved from the Marxist Center to the DSA. Cosmonaut Magazine was originally exploring a relationship with the Marxist Center, ultimately chose the DSA. And the Marxist Unity Group came out of that. They also weren't entirely speaking totally base builders. They were neo-Kotskyists, although even that's a deceptive term. I consider them what we might call early Leninist or something. Like they're very much into the largely paradigm of Kautsky to Lenin of the one is to be done era. Very much into the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Committee group kind of spirit, but nonetheless. It is possible that there was going on in the tendency that I was aware of. So this is necessarily an analysis of what was made it to the surface, the form of the appearance of the Marxist Center in its concrete expression, not its totality. So this is what somebody involved but not in the core saw. TLDR. 1. The key insight of the Marxist Center that the work needed to be done in civil society to lay the groundwork for the proper workers' movement was correct, but nobody got far beyond the initial insight. In practice, the organization that made up the tendency got swept up by the spontaneity of actionism into a treadmill of depoliticized mutual aid whose political value was seen as self-contained rather than instrumental. Yeah, that's always a problem. A mutual aid has a purpose, and also mutual aid is not charity. Anyway, the tactics was good because we were doing something, and nobody thought beyond this truism. Yeah, this is actionism, when you do something without thinking about all the systemic implications of the thing you are doing. So when people say, oh, you're critiquing us for actionism, all you're asking us to do is theory. No, theory by itself is kind of useless. Think about that Aristotelian triad that I used to tell you to think about. Theoria, theory. Praxis, practice, which is not just action. Praxis is informed by theoria, theory, reflection. And then poiesis, creation. All right. Clarifying what you think in a systemic way, that's theoria. Enacting that and embodying that, that's praxis or practice. Creating new things with that is poiesis. All right. Or creation. If you hear poiesis sounds like the verb form of poet, you're right, although poet means maker. So we'll come back to that. 2. My proposed reason for getting stuck in this tendency is a failure to make a true ideological break with progressive liberalism and to provide a positive alternative analysis or narrative that could lay the foundation for socialist politics. Although so many people who try to break with progressive liberalism end up um, either going into nostalgia for a prior form of socialist politics, which they often project onto some place in the present, even though they often don't really know that much about that place. Or what they do is tail the right because of some kind of perceived anti-liberalism. We see a lot of both right now, and sometimes in the same people. Back to this. This fair to break had symptoms at the level of org membership and leadership, as well as their points of social contact in their mass work. 3. The cultural institutional building was correctly identified as missing, never got built, because doing so required an ideological intervention that nobody was capable of making. So that the orgs just became sites of reproduction of progressive liberalism via an inefficient charity operations, which were more interested in serving the people than organizing them. And again, you guys know my critique. Organizing to do what and how? I see the O word overused. All right, symptom theory. Being that it was a program first political project, it shouldn't be surprising that the Marxist Center orgs didn't have a very coherent political ideology on the inside. As we attempted to expand and deepen our work, this became more of a problem. Now, I'm not a person who thinks that ideological coherence actually emerges before political work happens either. And I'm not sure this person is saying that. But, trying to lay out a program at a convention or a conference that happens very early on, it means your program is going to be necessarily insufficient. And it might be democratic for the small group of people that was there. And the Marxist Center was an org of orgs, which has its own problems. And we'll talk about that. It was not actually a totally independent org. And it was kind of a democracy of orgs as well. I don't believe that drawing endless lines of ideological or practical demarcation is a path to advancing this struggle. Thank you, because it's not. But I do think failing to make any lines at all leads invariably to opportunism and class collaboration. Some class collaboration, I'm always thinking about this because nobody has avoided class collaboration in some form. Now, do you think it is a virtue or is it a necessity of weakness? I think it is the latter. It is sometimes something you have to do. And also, which classes are you willing to collaborate with? There's many I won't. But anyway, I follow Lenin's critique of spontaneity and his observation that in the absence of a strong resistance to it, the bourgeois ideology naturally takes root in its subjects. And in this view, the center failed to put up a bulwark against the process. I mean, spontaneity has issues just like over reliance on structural or political orgs has issues. Both actually tend to replicate different elements of the current society. But you are right. The spontaneous line does not encourage the not just the party discipline. I mean, that's its own thing, but the self-discipline to really understand, reflect, and develop checks against trends that are just in the air. And of course, it's going to be, bourgeois liberalism for most people because that's the water that they swim in. And if it's not that, it'll be something else. But it's an emotivist response, and spontaneity alone leads to emotivism, just like over rigidity and organizational structure tends to lead to authority problems and quick breaks. I've never thought the whole spontaneity versus organization thing was particularly useful dialectic or a systems position to have, but nonetheless, it is what a lot of people deal with. The Marxist Center's abdication of the ideological struggle against liberal capitalist social inertia made base building into a process of quasi-transactional, developing a constituency of at least semi-passive beneficiaries via tenants organizations and handing out groceries. Yeah, I've seen this with working with anarchists who did base building like things too. I have talked about orgs I've worked with here in the West who have fallen to this tendency and then tended towards either just generic progressive liberalism or weird ass sectarianism that was super destructive. And that put me in contact with orgs and groups that I'd rather not talk about. rather than working to cohere the class into a potential political agent or even a personal agent. When you make someone dependent on ad hoc groceries, that's not mutual aid. That's a dependency relationship, and it's not going to create a political agent because it's not going to create a personal agent either. Um, or at the very least, members of the class into political agents. The dual power being developed by Marxist orgs was one sided. Yeah, I mean, duh. And in this sense, I guess I have to agree with the premise of Steve Lee's critique of the center's economism, though not at all where he takes it. You go back and listen to my discussion of Steve Lee's critique. The economism on display is not to be found in the decision not to pivot to some vacuous notion of addressing every manifestation of oppression, but that they didn't substantively bring theory or even true politics into the workers' movement at all. I mean, there are workers' groups that do this, even at the site of economic struggle that they were participating in. It was the economism in the classical what is to be done sense, economism as a rejection of the political, economism as a consequence of worshiping spontaneity, or of, in the Bernsteinian example, just thinking everything's going to take care of itself. Like accelerationism is also a form of did not seem prepared with a counter ideology to present to either the existing left or the working class, and so it collapsed ideologically into tailing progressivism, many such cases, and valorizing spontaneity and actionism by default, many such cases. Most resistance tends to do this, and I hate to tell you guys, but as a resistance to almost anything, it doesn't tend to end well. Look up what happened to the Right Rose Society. Even while it stood apart from the largest expression of these trends at the level of practice. As I understand it, the choice was explicitly to tail progressive liberalism, to dogmatically reproduce some imagined historical form of Marxism via simplistic phrase mongering, many such cases, all over the place, and to produce anew the entire novel analysis, which takes into consideration the historical workers' movement, as well as our present conditions in a way that is markedly distinct from both of the other choices. The first choice was undesirable because they were Marxists, and the second was undesirable because they were resisting the sectarian impulse. And the third, the task of our actual movement and the defining task of the Marxist tradition, proved beyond not simply the capacity of the tendency, but perhaps also its appetite. To the extent that the path was ever chosen deliberately, it was almost exclusively to tail progressive liberalism. For example, pamphlets applied to my org for Working Women's Day, which is the reiteration of the cultural feminism with this like all in like an Instagram filter. But more often, this tailing was only an implicit process that came about from not choosing a path at all, in the belief that the work itself carried its own meaning and political value. Nothing is defined by itself. Everything is defined in relation to something else. Fundamental premise from Varn, even at a metaphysical level for me. The absent counter ideology I would refer to tended to contend with the social and economic contradictions that make up the world, but it might reach really similar conclusions about certain issues to progressive or leftist, but must reach them from a different point of departure in a different logic than presented by progressive capitalist, reactionary capitalist, or sectarian socialist politics. Yet it must cut across these lines without slipping into vulgar populism or a workerism of the lowest common thought. And its analysis would need to confront the complexity and calcification of our political and economic situation, demonstrated in the work of contemporary theorists and scholars like Benjamin Studebaker and others. Many of you've read or talked to on the channel. She was talking to me here. It would need to ask how the change might become possible in the most practical sense, but without collapsing into the false pragmatism of the Democratic Party collaboration or popular frontism. For those of you who don't know, I am not a socialist make no ally, a socialist don't work with anyone ever person. Although I tend to think we need to be obstructionists more than when we're working with other people. And a lot of our consent is in what we don't obstruct. But I am a believer in the United Front strategy, the early United Front strategy, where you do not try to sit and govern with people who you do not agree with. I mean, I guess in some limited sense, I would be okay with a popular front amongst socialists who had a common agreement on programs that overlap strongly. But I would not be in that with progressives, even if I think that working with progressives on specific issues or to stop specific things of specific administrations may be worth doing. Uh, for that sake, there are certain things that working with conservatives and libertarians is even worth doing if you do not make the mistake of trying to empower them beyond that. All allegiances there must be temporal and temporary, of a time and for a limited period of time, and never pretending that anything else is the case. But anyway, back to this. Its horizon would have to confront the nearly impossible task of developing the practical capacity of self-governance of the proletariat in a world that has been irreversibly bureaucratized. I mean, it's been worse than bureaucratized at this point. It was bureaucratized in the 50s. All right, to create conditions necessary for a dictatorship of the proletariat, which those conditions probably won't involve using that word, but nonetheless. All this is extremely difficult and complicated, and it carries great risk, and all revolutionary activity must. But it does not demonstrate its immediate benefit in the face of immediate atrocity. Even more than the contents of the hypothetical socialism versus some other ideology, these facts themselves, the difficulty, the risk, the retreat from the immediate, are what make the break from moralistic progressivism necessary, a break that must be made in the organizers and architecture of the project itself, and not just at a rhetorical level. Ultimately, building socialism and growing progressivism are not compatible tasks. I mean, I think progressivism is a curse, personally. Um, Either in the world or in the mind. Yet one of these tasks leads us out of the swamp. But Marxists of the day, as much as they love to use Mao as a stand-in for Marx and Lenin, still keep both kinds of goods in stock and find a use for each. And in so much as they fail to replace their liberalism with Marxism, they are not capable of building socialism. I mean, it really puts the task on something outside of the socialist or workers' base, which is kind of a problem for Marxists. If the base builders actually had produced an analysis that properly met the moment in precisely the way that the progressives and sectarians cannot, we might have been able to provide an organizational blueprint for a new kind of Marxist practice. But due to the tendency, material independence of liberal institutions that the government socialists are compelled to collaborate with, the NGOs, the Democratic Party, the base builders had a great opportunity to develop, at least in a very provisional and incipient form, the kinds of social counter institutions that might constitute the basis of an eventual production and proliferation of a revolutionary proletarian consciousness, any kind of consciousness. Again, this seems to be the stated goal of the Marxist Center itself. The echo of its necessity rings out today from the corners of the post-millennial left to bar framing. I'll talk about my thoughts on that flaming on another day, but not right now. While sectarians project onto the masses whatever idea class fits their needs, yeah, oh my God, yes. And the government socialists inherit the Democratic Party demographic breakdowns. Those who are still trying to cling to some semblance of materialism must see through the fragmentation of the working class and through the fragmentation. Part of this working through must involve the creation of social institutions that can facilitate the re-subjectification of people as capable social and political subjects from their degraded position. Thank you. Of passive consumers of political narratives and identities, aka all the political fandoms out there, are victims of the cultural terror perpetuated by the same. Against all the odds, it fails to the disempowered left to lay conditions for laying the conditions for some kind of basic movement for socialism to actually emerge in force, or if you prefer, as I do, for the construction of a mass workers' party. For me, this is precisely the core insight of the base building going back to the Black Panther Party, creating durable sites of ideological and social penetration of what workers and revolutionary party, and the unrealized core of the potential in the form of the Marxist center orgs. I will say, though, we have to admit the Black Panther Party also failed at this itself. All right. But while these organizations might have been creating the material basis for such sites via their small scale work, they lack the analysis and orientation that would allow for them to be fundamentally different from the social entity of anarchist mutual aid are 401c charities. In fact, most anarchist mutual aid starts looking more like 401c charities if they have any success at all. And to salt the wound, even if someone in these parties had developed these ideological materials like my small online cadre was trying to do, these parties were not set up in a way that could really integrate and make use of such intervention. A bit more on that later. I would like to talk about the structure because I actually don't entirely know it, but I've heard some things. Simpson, in my tiny org, destitution of politics was severe. There was literally no component of political education in our programs, and there was no political education inside our party until I tried to develop some. Actually, it was even worse than this description. They were afraid to even put the party's name on the grocery. In my counterparts' organization were not so dire as this. They were a major thought leader on the Tendency rather than a tiny affiliate, but that org was clearly not equipped to undertake the transformation from a red charity into a service programs that also function as and simple institutions of proletariat civil society. It's hard to scale up that way. Even churches right now have trouble doing it. As for the rest of the affiliated groups, I can only say that I watched a dozen or so presentations at the Marxist Interconvention, and they universally consisted in org members fully and uncritically repeating progressive liberal talking points while showing off their community service projects. They really talked about politics or economics. Nobody talked about education and the subjective component, and nobody really workers except maybe some token workerism. And I'm not just being a bitchy Marxist intellectual here. These presenters were demonstrating less theoretical engagement than a Jacobin article. Ouch. Diagonal work is a long-standing tradition in this country, and there are people more equipped than me to elaborate on the history and its reasons. But I'll systemically offer the observations and interpretations I made during the period, which seem to me to explain why it is so hard to open the ideological dimension back up once I started trying to do so. Well, I think ideologies are harder to create synthetically than most people realize. Most ideologies aren't created synthetically, and that's something that I think people don't know how to deal with. But let's get back to this. First, as I mentioned above, there is no internal political education taking place in my party when I joined. One of the consequences of this is that the membership was little more prepared to address the complexity of our situation, especially since its political dimension and how we would distinguish ourselves from the broader left without abandoning key values than the average worker we were serving. Members mostly joined as progressive activists and remain progressive activists, and thus their contributions to the party discussions and decisions were the contributions of progressive activists. And it's worth noting that these people were represented in the org in the course of carrying out our work, and so they did so as progressive activists. Complain about this in the DSA too. Without working to advance and alleviate the political understanding and capacity for analysis of our members, that's why I talk about skilling up so much. You need to skill your members, but not just in theory, although that's also important. The party was constantly drifting towards a spontaneous actionism stance that is so naturally osmosed from our culture. No polyed also meant no shared sense of history and our own context, which might have helped inform our work and prevent us from repeating various eras of the last 20 years. It might have helped. Second, I would venture that the particular issue of depolitization of mass work can be seen as a failure of party building, specifically understood as a failure to establish good formal internal procedures for resolving the contradiction between the desire for a non-sectarian pluralist form of organization and the need for that organization to put forward a coherent or at least somewhat unified, that point is probably the most important part, political analysis and narrative to the public. This is a tough question for any coalition, but because this question wasn't raised from the structure of the org itself, it never got answered. And the issues of our politicizing our programs became disconnected side issue to tack on after the fact. That never works. Rather than the core element of the design of our programs themselves, in which case we might have asked, can we develop a program that is more socially engaged than handing out groceries to begin with? Are you empowering people to work for themselves, or are you adding another dependency to their lives? I'm not saying giving people groceries is bad, but sometimes you do have to teach a person to fish. Finally, the core issue I felt and saw both in my party and the Marxist Center itself, and in Left Book and in all the orgs in the U.S., is a two-sided anti-intellectualism that has permeated the left for longer than I've been alive. On one side, the party of activists valorize spontaneity and does not essentially believe theory is necessary to guide their work, treating theory as separate, almost fetishistic thing. Even if they might read it, they only do so in the most formalistic, ahistorical, and dogmatic way to use to justify whatever they were already going to do. Yep, I've definitely seen that. Are they gleaning slogans to deploy as a rhetorical cudgel? Yep, seen that too. Yet on the other side, they paternalistically withhold the theory from the workers, not on the basis that the workers don't need it, but the way activists doesn't need it. The way activists doesn't need it, but the workers cannot handle it. The paternalism thing. I fucking hate this. There is simply a belief that working people are not capable of engaging with political theory at all. And this is what really drove me away from the formation as a whole. I believe that various expressions of progressivism, pragmatism, moralism, vulgar empiricism, etc., must all be managed non-antagonistically in an org. We can't all have to think the same to get the work done. Nope. And that's what sectarians mistake. They think that you have to have a coherent, synthetically made ideology that unifies everybody before you get off the ground. And that almost never works. And even when you do seem to have it, you often don't. It's often an imposition. But the internal anti-intellectualism seems to make even attempts to correcting truly destructive deviations impossible. It is also worth noting that anti-intellectualism is particularly well suited to the faux anti-elite moral politicking of the progressive liberalism, which is almost purely emotive, which had already fully suffused these organizations. Lacking a deep belief in the necessity of theory as a living process that must be allowed to unfold inside the party and in the party's work in society or any org. Any org needs guiding principles, programmatics, orientations, etc. And if you don't have it, the org will start doing something else, and that will become its function. The base building tendency capitulated to this trend, and in doing so got subsumed by spontaneity in all forms, ultimately failing to make interventions it was poised to make within the broader left or within society at large. For all the resentment I have for the depoliticized mutual aid fetishism, I still believe durable aid programs offer the possibility of transformation into something more. And I do not think the potential of this framework was exhausted by the historical unfolding in the Marxist center, which was never huge. Though I hold that it cannot prevail without its organizing entity taking up a radically different orientation than any that currently exists in substantive form. 2018 to 2025. As I attempted to push for political and ideological engagement inside the party and our work, I quickly became ostracized. I ended up voicing, I admit brazenly, some of the critique of the Marxist Center gathering, and that later got used as, in my opinion, spurious pretext to remove me from my party. That sounds normal. I decided to resign rather than go through party litigation because it had already become clear that that Marxism was not welcome there. I have my resignation letter that details this period a bit more, if that's of any interest. Yeah, I'm not reading it on the air probably, but I would be interested. Shortly after that, I fell out of political work for a long time due to disability and its attendant destabilization of my personal life. I have only recently begun getting myself oriented to the present conjuncture and excavating all the political education from its dormancy. Unsurprisingly, I'm dejected by the character of the remaining left, which has only dug itself even deeper and doubled down on its worst elements. I accept the thesis that the spectacle of this maximal moralist positions obscure that it's in reality total nihilism, which is pretty painful to really reckon with. The left seems to be completely disinterested in doing politics or confronting its own failure. A statement that described reality in 2017 no less than today, although the Marxist Center gave it a kind of pre-political veneer that created the illusion of motion. I'm doing my best not to get completely suckered into a platypus phase, though honestly, the alternative might be to depoliticize again. I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I would do neither. The personal causes of my initial dropping out are hardly resolved, and I no longer believe I have an intervention to make it that isn't elsewhere being made more effectively or having its limits revealed. So I might just pack it all up and see what's left in another 10 years. I think a lot of the people in your Tennessee did that, frankly, and I wouldn't blame you. I've known a lot of smart people who just fell off. I really feel that I only have so much of this stuff in me, given my health and other things. So if I'm going to contribute to this process, I do not want to waste my effort. But I have not yet allowed the facticity of this despair dictate what I am doing. I think I believe more in the value of primitive accumulation of cadres than you do. Yes, you probably do. Provided they actually put the effort into applying their study to the basic questions of the movement. How else can we chart a new path? But for now, my focus is even more basic. I've been working on getting connected with them with local mass style orgs. And it looks like I have a pretty solid Green Party chapter in my area doing some interesting things for what it is. Although I suspect you're going to see a lot of tailism in that. I will probably participate in that a bit just to start getting involved again. Find people who resonate with my politics and maybe try to adapt some ideas that I've been working through for uses as a party media of some kind. I'm also interested in using the Green Party as a testbed for some counter narratives against third party fatalism that dominates U.S. political culture. It sounds like there's an opportunity in Green Party chapter to community program in my city, basically along the same lines as base building. They arrived at a similar point via Ostelan and Bookchin, funnily enough. That is funny, but it's also not surprising. So there might be a chance to see how these dynamics of this kind of program might pay out under different politics. But for now, I think all we can hope for is to fail in a different, more productive way and try to take notes. Fail better. To paraphrase Samuel Beckett, whose stoic Irish face is usually looking down from my shelf right about there. There's a lot here. I mean, I've moved away from a lot of this Marxist phraseology these days into more systems phraseology, but I basically agree with a lot of this. Anti-progressivism doesn't get you out of progressivism, nor does spontaneity getting out of you the need of organization. And one of the temptations for when you realize how much of the left is stuck in a kind of progressive liberal mode are cultural activist modes, are going into work first without understanding what the work is for. It's really demoralizing. I would like to know more about the org of the Marxist Center, how it was actually structured. I know it was kind of an org of orgs, but its precise charter and dynamics were never clear to me. And I heard a bunch of things from people who left it who were disgruntled. And because they're disgruntled, I never know entirely how to take it. But let's add this to the chart of things and analysis and postmortems about what happened with the Marxist Center and the base building tendency. Will the base building tendencies in the DSA have more success? It's hard to say because they're in a more rigid structure, but one that has different problems, but a lot of the same problems about progressivism, and even a more difficult to parse relationship to the Democratic Party. There's a basic misunderstanding of game theoretical calculus in the DSA there. I mean, the squad was never going to have leverage. Whether or not you think they were sheepdogging you intentionally or unintentionally is irrelevant. Some people get mad that I state it charitably, but my point is it doesn't matter if they meant to or not. It is not that, unless you have a smoking gun that they have bad intentions and some kind of actual statement in some back room that got published, you don't really know. You're just using your best guesses about why they would do certain things and sheepdog certain ways. But let me tell you the basic thing of it. You can't hold, as I've said over and over again, you can't hold electeds accountable unless you can protect them, and you can't protect them if there's other parties that have more leverage and more power than you do. And that doesn't matter how popular you are unless people have a deep commitment and way to institutionalize that popularity as leverage. Similarly, mutual aid should be both skilling, not just charity. So everyone involved should be getting skills and stuff out of it and developing themselves mutually. Otherwise, it's just going to burn people out. But the DSA's answer to that was often just to go for electoral campaigns, which also have very high cost and very low likelihood of being successful in most local areas. For the same game theoretical reason I just said. So, good luck on that. Until there's a place that even left politicians could legitimately defect to actually outside of the Democratic Party, they will have liberal leverage within the Democratic Party because there is a place for right-leaning and center-leaning people to go. Now, ironically, on the right, there's been a insider-outsider strategy for a long time, but they were also more willing to leave and had more places to go. Even though there's probably more left parties in the third party movement that run candidates, although I'm not sure about that, than right ones. The real places they had to go were para institutions where they could wait out a situation in the GOP and then come back later. Even the paleo conservatives did this, and in the age of Trump, that seems to have had some limited success. But there aren't places where far leftists could wait it out and have an influence on actual political structures, domestic and not. And with that in mind, we should be thinking about building it. I hope this helps you understand why I think the base building tendency got caught up, but it's still one of the more interesting tendencies to discuss. And there's a clear postmortem there. The DSA is still developing, and it can go in a lot of different directions, both good or bad. And the Green Party has been doing its post Camejo, post, post Nader, post even Stein, breathing in and out for a long time. It was always supposed to be watermelon and green with a pink core. I guess watermelon also means something else now. It should be that too, I suppose. But nonetheless, here we are. Protect your peace, people, and I hope this helps you. If this interlocutor wants me to release this in writing on my Substack and on my Patreon, I'd be happy to do so. And if other people who have experiences of the Marxist Center want to come out and talk about it, I'd happily welcome you on the show. Take care.